Ladies and gentlemen, it's not a secret that the Reagan administration inherited an economy in very poor shape. Indeed, an economy that had been in poor shape through most of the 1970s. Last spring, it promised a relatively painless and a relatively prompt 3 to 4 year cure. The subject that has been assigned the four of us, the subject before the House, is whether that cure is likely to work, and if not, whether there is a better alternative. It is a pleasure to welcome my fellow panelists. William Niskanen, a veteran of the Kennedy administration, is one of the 3 members of President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. Before that, he was director of economics at the Ford Motor Corporation. Before that, he was a professor at the Graduate School of Management at UCLA, and at our sister, before that, at our sister institution, the Graduate School of Public Policy at Berkeley. Alan Meltzer is the John Olin Professor of Political Economy at Carnegie Mellon University, distinguished monetary economist. He is co-chairman of the unofficial Shadow Open Market Committee, so-called, that keeps a sharp eye on the fiscal and monetary sins of the federal government. Professor Kenneth Galbraith, you all know, I teach economics in this building. In thinking about this subject last evening, I was struck by the contrast between the remarkable clarity of the Reagan program as presented last spring and the murky confusedness of the debate that has followed. Indeed, in a sense, our task this evening is to try and improve on that. No easy matter. Adversary, time-constrained panel discussions on complicated technical matters that are loaded with value sometimes provide entertainment. They rarely converge on truth. In order to improve the odds somewhat, I will spend 10 minutes trying to frame the issues. I do so with some trepidation and against the strong advice yesterday of my colleague Kenneth Galbraith, who said to me that in light of my delicate double role as moderator and panelist, that, these are my words, not his, that if I managed to say anything sharp and to the point, it would be taken as unfair and adversary, and if I did not so manage, why bother? I will try to walk that tightrope. If I do say something unfair, I have no doubt that Alan Meltzer and Bill Niskanen will straighten me out very quickly. I do think it's a merit, a great virtue of the original presentation of the Reagan program that it was numerically explicit. I know Bill Niskanen doesn't exactly agree. It was explicit both about its prescription and about its intended result. With respect to prescription, it stated exactly what levels of government purchases, what tax rates, what transfer payment schedules it wished the Congress to adopt year by year between now and 1985, and what quantities of money it wished the Federal Reserve to provide. With respect to objectives, in the domain of macroeconomics first, it made clear its belief that that prescription, if adopted, would cause real output in the United States over the next 4 or 5 years to increase at a very fast 4+% per annum rate, that would cause the unemployment rate to fall from its current 8%, and in the spring it may be 9%, to well below 6% by 1985, 1986, and that at the same time, that same policy would reduce the underlying rate of wage price inflation from its current roughly 9% to somewhere near 5%. I don't want to tie either Alan Meltzer or Bill Niskanen to those particular numbers, but I think they will agree that in terms of order of magnitude, they do reflect the Reagan administration's intentions, and that the Reagan program will have to be judged in part by how close it comes to those kinds of magnitudes. With respect to at least one of its structural objectives, the composition of output, the program was also very clear. It said that if the prescription is adopted, then between now and the end of the first Reagan term, the level of federal expenditures should decline in proportion to the projected gross national product, from roughly 23% to somewhere below 20%, maybe 19.5. Since during that period, federal defense expenditures are intended to rise from 5.5% of GNP to 6.5% of GNP, the associated reduction in federal civilian expenditures, civilian purchases, transfer payments, grants in aid to state and local government, would have to drop from 17.5% to some number like 13.5%, 14%, a large reduction. The program was rather less clear, I think it's fair to say, about any projected income distributional results. Clearly, those are not intended as an objective of the program, yet I think they probably have to be looked at in evaluating the program. So, there's been clarity about prescription and clarity about intended results. Why has the debate been so murky? An answer, I believe, has to do with the fact that neither the critics nor the defenders have been sufficiently clear about the distinction between what I rather awkwardly called the macroeconomic objectives of the program on the one hand and the structural objectives. The distinction is not watertight. There is an intersection. But it's very important because the two sets of objectives raise very different kinds of questions. Take the macroeconomic objectives. There is no question of desirability here. If the administration comes even close to achieving those results, it will have been a macroeconomic triumph. There is a question of attainability. Will the Reagan program, for that matter, will any program, achieve simultaneously that a reasonably fast pace of growth, real output, a sharp reduction in unemployment and idle capacity, and at the same time, something like a halving of the underlying rate of inflation? On the other hand, the structural objectives certainly don't raise any question of technical as distinct from political attainability. The question there, I think the four of us will agree, is one of desirability. What value judgments, what conception of a good society argue for such a shift in resource allocation from public civilian use of resources, some to defense, some to private use, and in the distribution of income? So, one set of policies leading to two sets of results, macroeconomic and structural. The issue with respect to macroeconomic that I hope that my colleagues will discuss has to do with attainability. The issue with respect to structural with desirability. But I've talked too much. Bill, why don't you take over? Dr. Niskanen.
Thank you. It is good to return to Harvard. May I use this occasion to acknowledge a debt that I owe to Professor Galbraith. As a student in his undergraduate course 30 years ago, his teachings motivated me to continue my study of economics at Chicago. At this forum, it is appropriate to recognize that the Reagan economic program is remarkably similar to the program initiated by President John Kennedy. The Kennedy budgets, for example, substantially increased defense spending and maintained a tight restraint on domestic spending. A major business tax reduction was initiated in '62, and a personal tax reduction was initiated in 1964. The growth of the money supply was maintained at a low rate, and a program to reduce economic regulation was initiated. One of his major accomplishments was the Kennedy round of trade negotiations, which produced the freest trade environment in the post-war years. As of 1965, the last budget prepared by the Kennedy administration, defense spending was about 7% of GNP. The total federal share was 18%. The budget was balanced. Real GNP increased by 6%, and the inflation rate was 2%, a remarkable record. Both the program and the objectives of the Reagan economic program are remarkably similar to that of the Kennedy program. Although the rhetoric has changed, both of these programs were rationalized in terms of the new economics of the time. The major difference between these programs concerns the starting conditions. In 1960, the defense program was relatively stronger. The federal share of GNP was still only about 18%. The budget had a $3 billion surplus, and the inflation rate was 1.6%. In 1980, in contrast, the defense program had weakened substantially. The federal share of GNP had grown to 23%. The federal budget was $61 billion in deficit, and the inflation rate was 9% or higher. Both 1960 and 1980 were years of slight recessions, the only real common element of the starting conditions. In summary, both President Kennedy and President Reagan initiated similar programs towards similar goals following very different starting conditions. What are the most important lessons to be learned from the first 10 months of the Reagan administration? One very important set of lessons is that some of the more optimistic early forecasts of the effects of the Reagan economic program will not be realized. In Washington, rosy scenario has been about as seductive as Fanny Fox, but the affairs usually do not last very long. For example, it is now recognized that any major reduction in federal spending requires substantial reductions in the service levels for many programs. The hope that budget restraint could be achieved by reducing only waste, fraud, and abuse evaporated early in the administration. We must now make the more difficult case that many programs are not worthwhile or appropriate for the federal government to maintain. Second, it is now recognized that the broad-based reduction in federal tax rates will reduce federal tax revenues. The belief that prior tax rates were above the revenue-maximizing rates on the Laffer curve has died slowly, but it is not now generally held. Three, it is now recognized that we face large budget deficits for some years. We must now make the more difficult case for even larger budget reductions, possibly some tax increases, or that the prospective deficits are not a matter of great concern. Four, it is now recognized that inflation cannot be reduced without some near-term loss of real output. The rational expectations hypothesis that a pre-announced consistent program of monetary restraint would change price expectations quickly is probably correct, but has yet to receive a fair test. Our economic history suggests that it is not rational to change expectations quickly based only on the announcement of a policy change. And monetary restraint has not been consistent for very long. In any case, the present recession has a very simple explanation. The money supply is about the same now in early December as it was in April of 1981, following a money growth rate of around 11% in the prior 12 months. The effect of this dramatic change in money growth from 11% in the prior 12 months to 0 in effect between April and now are that the near-term real output, inflation rates, and interest rates will all be lower than we expected earlier. Although the economic profession characteristically is still debating the merits of a gradual versus an abrupt reduction in money growth, the Fed seems to have opted for the cold bath treatment. This policy, I want to suggest, is clearly wrong only to those with a very short time horizon. Short-term interest rates have already declined by over 6 percentage points since their earlier peaks. This and other recent events lead us to believe that the recession will be short, rather like that in 1980, with real output increasing again within another month or so. This forecast is dependent, however, on an expectation that the Fed will maintain money growth within its announced target range rather than to futilely try to support interest rates at the low end. Final lesson: it is now recognized that regulations cannot be substantially reduced without changing the basic enabling legislation. A number of recent court decisions have made it clear that regulators are not free to interpret their authority broadly, even if the legislatively prescribed standards are patently unreasonable. We must now make the more difficult case to change the structure of some of our major regulatory laws. Now, few economists, in or out of the administration, should have been surprised by any one of these lessons. The events of the last year, however, have led to a broader understanding of these lessons. The major implication of these lessons is that we must change our forecasts, not our policy. At the same time, it is important to avoid judging the policies of the administration by the accuracies of its forecasts. No one forecasts very well, and the forecasts of any administration are characteristically optimistic. An administration should be judged by whether the policies that it has put in place are appropriate to the problems of the time, and we are prepared to be judged on that basis. The second important set of lessons on which there is not a general consensus outside the administration is that the four main elements of the Reagan economic program are correct and should not be changed. Continued reduction of domestic spending, including that for programs which were previously on the reserve list, is necessary given whatever defense increases are appropriate to avoid increasing the federal share of our national output. If Congress approves all of our probable spending proposals, the defense share of GNP in 1985 would be about the same as that during the Kennedy administration, and the total federal share would still be several percentage points higher than during that period. Each of us, abstracting from whether we are beneficiaries of specific federal programs, behind the veil of ignorance, to use John Rawls' phrase, most of us, I contend, would favor reducing or eliminating many federal programs. Second, there is no case for deferring or reversing the major tax cuts that were approved earlier this year without necessarily supporting every jot and tittle of that change. For most taxpayers, the reduction in personal income tax rates was barely sufficient to prevent an increase in marginal rates on real income. The business tax cuts are necessary to divert a larger share of our total savings toward business investment. Some minor changes in user fees and in the tax code are being considered, but primarily to reduce misallocative effects. One important implication of this conclusion is that we should be prepared to tolerate moderately large federal deficits. Our models, however, suggest that federal deficits do not have significant effects on money growth, inflation, or interest rates. So there is no reason to be concerned that the prospective deficits jeopardize the other objectives of our program. Third, continued monetary restraint is necessary to reduce inflation. We endorse a gradual reduction in the Fed's announced target range for money growth. We are concerned, however, that the Fed maintain money growth within the announced range on a quarter-to-quarter basis, rather than correcting for the departures from this range in a prior period, as was the case in 1980. A reduction in the variance of money growth is important to minimize the real effects of reducing inflation, in order to increase the signal-to-noise ratio, basically, in terms of people's expectations. I hope that the day has passed when some economists still recommend tolerating continued high inflation. We still have a lot to learn, however, about how to reduce inflation with tolerable real effects. Finally, a renewed effort is necessary to maintain the momentum for deregulation, a momentum which I believe we have lost somewhat. The organization established by the executive order, now headed by Chris DeMuth of this school, has been successful in reducing the number of new regulations by executive agencies and has eliminated some minor existing regulations. We have probably missed, however, our major first opportunity to restructure one of the major regulatory laws in the deliberations on renewal of the Clean Air Act. Moreover, there has been some amount of re-regulation in several areas, including trucking, communications, and civil aviation. Deregulation is still one of the four main elements of the Reagan economic program, but we have yet to design an organization and a process to monitor and discipline this increasingly important dimension of federal economic policy. In summary, the experience of the first 10 months of the Reagan administration leads me, and I suggest should lead you, to the following general conclusions. Some of the more optimistic forecasts of the effects of the program will not be realized. Some of the details of the program should probably be changed, and other details have yet to be developed. Most importantly, however, the four main elements of the program reflect the best contemporary economic analysis, are correct, and should not be changed, and deserve your support. Thank you.
I should like to begin by saying a word of welcome to my colleagues this evening. Also, a considerable and sincere word of admiration. I'm awfully sorry that I was responsible for that digression of Mr. Niskanen. I forgive him, however, and I must say I enormously admire his courage in the task that he has had to undertake this evening. I also react with warmth and admiration to the considerable, indeed I would almost say massive, area of confession which we have now had and which has become a commonplace for the administration. If I might digress for a moment, I'm impressed by the enormous influence I've had. Not only did I send Mr. Niskanen to Chicago, but I also am told by a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, of all things, that I launched Mr. Stockman on his career. He told the reporter who asked him if he'd had any economics at Harvard. He said, no, none at all, only a course from Galbraith. What we are concerned here this evening is not a question of liberalism or conservatism, but a question of the controlling role of hard circumstance. Mr. Reagan, my old ADA colleague, brought not one but two schools of economists, perhaps one should use the word shoals, to Washington. Both of them, I venture to say, in spite of the effort of my colleague to get under the excellent cover of the Kennedy administration, both of these schools untried. We hadn't previously associated conservative administrations with extreme experimentalism. We will from now on. There was the supply-side economics, tax reduction, much of it in small amounts going to the many, but in the large amounts to the few, and an expansion of the economy sufficient to recover the revenues so sacrificed. I'm happy to note that Mr. Niskanen has confessed on that point. I hope he will go on to confess on the theory that lies back of this tax reduction, especially on the affluent, on the theory that the rich were not working because they were getting too little, and the poor were not working because they were getting too much. This is a view that is especially hard on the affluent. Because one has to ask what our higher income people have been doing up till now. Essentially, evidently, they have been sitting back, soldiering off, idling, because of the level of their income tax brackets. I had dinner tonight with a raft of tax lawyers who are here in the audience, and I can only assume that they were consulting all of the time with you rather than running their business. Now, with the reduction of the personal income tax, you will not see them anymore. We will have a vast burst of energy. This is something which we all know now, as a result of the Stockman confession, to be a cover, the notion of a supply-side response, a cover for tax reduction. What in my somewhat vulgar youth was called the horse and sparrow theory. That if you feed a horse enough oats, something will pass through to the road for the sparrows. The other schools here, I must say with all sincerity, ably represented by one of my old colleagues, is that holds that you can control the money supply, although I think we will have to agree, a substantial imprecision. Today there was a very big unexpected increase when there was an expected reduction. And we also know that if the effort is pressed hard enough, it works. And it's working now against inflation. It's working now by putting all of the three big automobile companies into losses, International Harvester into extreme peril, Pan Am and the other airlines into possible threat of bankruptcy, some of the others, housing into the worst slump since the Great Depression, the thrift industries in very bad condition, and a prospect an official government prospect of 9 million unemployed. Abstracting from that unemployment, I must say, in defense of the administration, that it is impartial. That when you consider that most of these other industries are headed and manned by Republicans, you'll have to say this administration can bite its own. If you make things bad enough, you can certainly arrest inflation. But look what we have. A doctrine of supply-side economics which seeks to expand the economy, a doctrine of for the control of inflation which works only through the kind of contraction we have just seen. An economics which policy which, if I may use a metaphor, and I'm not going certainly to talk about Trojan horses,
labor costs pushing up prices pulling wages after them again, on the one hand, and the measured inflation rates that are slowing down, partly because of unemployment, but partly because we have suffered the big increase in oil prices that we suffered in 1979, 1980, and that's over, partly because the dollar foreign exchange rate has improved by 15-20%, and that has made imports very much cheaper, so that we're enjoying a transient respite from inflation, rather bigger slowdown than we can count on for the long haul. And in part, it's a direct consequence of the unemployment. We've been operating with 7+% unemployment rates for some time. We are now at 8. That's not a minor recession. As Ken Galbraith pointed out, we're talking about more than 8 million people out of work. We're talking about a loss of real output and real income relative to what the economy could produce if we were at 6% unemployment, of the order of 5% of GNP. 5% of GNP today, we're talking about $150 billion roughly per annum. That's an awful lot of lost real income, lost real wages, lost real profits. Now, we have to do something about inflation. In order to do something about the underlying inflation, I think we would be agreed, one has to slow down the rate of increase in unit labor costs per unit of output. In order to slow down the increase in unit labor costs, in labor costs per unit of output, one has to narrow the gap between the rate of increase of wage rates. On the one hand, currently, over the last 2 years, it's been running about 10%, and the trend rate of increase in productivity, in output per worker hour, which is thought to be running at about 1% per annum. One has to shrink that gap. One way to try and shrink that gap is to speed up the rate of growth of productivity. That's where all the shift of resources to investment comes in. The difficulty is that that is very slow and very uncertain business. Furthermore, even if we do succeed in getting the share of business fixed investment up from 10, 11% to, say, 13, 14%, even if that does succeed in creating a massive success with respect to productivity growth, raising it, say, from 1% per annum trend to 2% or 2.5% per annum, an enormous improvement. Real income and real output will then be able to grow a lot faster, twice or 2.5 times as fast as it has been. But in terms of contribution to inflation, initially all it'll mean is a point and a point and a half. With wages up at 10% per annum, productivity is going up at 2% rather than 1%, labor costs will only be going up at 8%. 10 minus 2 rather than 10 minus 1. It's a start. The resulting reduction in prices will feed back into wages, and over a period of 6, 7, 8 years, if there's no trouble from oil or food or foreign exchange, we will in fact unwind the inflation. It is too slow and is too vulnerable to what happens to commodity prices, to the foreign exchange rate, to oil prices. So if you want to make progress on inflation, you've got to do something about slowing down wages. We would be agreed, I think, that to slow down wages, it is necessary to slow down the rate of rise in money spending for goods and services, total public plus private spending for produced goods and services. Furthermore, I think we would be agreed that in order to slow down total spending, and Alan Meltzer has mentioned this, it is necessary and sufficient to slow down the rate of growth of money supply. I think if you want to avoid a very bumpy ride, you've got to match that with a fiscal policy, a budgetary policy that complements that monetary policy. A policy package that consists of stepping on the monetary brakes while you are stepping on the fiscal accelerator is going to give you an awful lot of bumps. And therefore, some tightening of fiscal policy in 1983, 1984, after the recession is over, is probably necessary for a sensible disinflation policy. So, tighten money, have a tighter fiscal policy, slow down the rate of growth of money supply. We're agreed about all that. What's the argument about? The argument is about what happens when you do succeed in slowing down nominal spending like that. Nominal spending consists of the product of quantities of goods and services demanded multiplied by their prices. The question is, when you do slow down total spending, prices times quantities, how much of the effect comes on prices, lower prices, which you want, and how much comes in lower output, more unemployment, more idle capacity, which we do not want. At heart, if you put aside all the sort of laugher supply side nonsense and the snake oil stuff and get serious, that is the underlying serious empirical issue. Look at it from a slightly different perspective. A reduction in spending for goods and services constitutes, from the point of view of producers and sellers, a reduction in the inflow of orders and sales. The question is, when they face a reduction in orders and sales and a piling up of inventory, how will they respond? What adjustments will they make in the output they choose to produce and in the prices which they quote and charge? That's the central issue. I'm pessimistic, much more pessimistic than Alan Meltzer, and I share Ken Galbraith's pessimism in this respect, is that the evidence suggests that mainline American industry, when faced by a reduction in orders and sales and an unwanted piling up of inventory, reduces output and cuts back employment quickly and shades price increases only very gradually. Why? Not because they are sinful, but as long as their wage rates and labor costs keep going up, they have no choice but to mark up prices. Profit margins are much too thin in order to absorb cumulative increases in labor costs of 8-9% per annum. The real mystery, if there is a mystery, has to do why wage rates keep going up, tend to keep going up at their inherited rates in the face of high and growing unemployment. We are back to the central issue raised by Lord Keynes, who said in modern industrial societies, wage rates are sticky. Today, it's the rates of change in wage rates that are sticky. The evidence on how much unemployment you need and how much idle capacity in order to gain on inflation is very disturbing. During the last 35 years, and I apologize for all this arithmetic, during the last 35 years, one extra point of unemployment over and above the 6% today, which is where the labor market seems to be in balance. One extra point of unemployment held for a year will $100 billion over 4 years. One is talking about roughly a 4-year cost of $9,1981 per American family. It doesn't strike me like a very good bargain. The question is, what alternatives? There is no question that in order to slow the inflation down, one does have to slow down the rate of increase in money supply, complement it with a relatively tight fiscal policy. There's no question that what you have to do, and that's why you do it, is to slow down the rate of growth of nominal spending. The question is, can you do anything else to make sure that more of that reduction in spending comes in the form of reduction in prices, in P, and less of it comes in the reduction of Q? And that is where the Galbraith suggestion comes in. Can you do anything to work directly to slow down the rate of wage inflation? And I put it on wages. And when I first wrote about this, a lawyer friend of mine in Washington with good labor connections called me up and said, "You used to have friends in the labor movement." I put it on wages because I think they are key. If we operate the economy with a fair amount of slack, with unemployment rates in the, not in the 8-9 range, but in the high 6, low 7 range. Then, if you manage to get labor costs down, wages down, and labor costs down, you will have no trouble from profit margins and prices, except for such things as oil and food and foreign exchange, and you don't want to sit on those prices. The difficulty with a rigid price control program is that you're in a box. You don't want to lock up the movement of relative prices, of price ratios, because they constitute the signal incentive system of the scheme, and if you lock those tight, very soon you're going to be in serious trouble, and the system will bust. You will have queues and shortages and everything else, and the system will not hold. I think it's possible to do something about slowing down wage rates and getting them closer to the rate of increase of average productivity by some kind of tax-based incentive system. I think that's possible without doing too much damage to relative prices, if at the same time you keep the economy relatively slack, and if at the same time you supplement whatever else you do with sensible supply-side measures, not snake oil, such as increasing the share of investment in business fixed investment and public investment in output. Then I think we have a chance of getting out of this. Without some kind of a program like that, I'm afraid we are in very deep trouble, and I will not forecast whether the deep trouble will consist in great improvement on inflation between now and 1984, but at the cost of a very large reserve army of unemployed, and miserable performance with respect to output, productivity, and real income, or whether the failure will come the other way, which is a pretty good growth performance between 1982 and 1984, pretty good growth in real income, not bad at all, but you end up with the underlying rate of inflation at 8-9% by the end of the 4 years. If you're lucky on oil, food, and foreign exchange, and if you're not, the thing gets ratcheted up to 11-12% by 1984. I will now stop except for one last comment. The proposition that the only way to get private investment up in proportion to the GNP is by cutting government civilian expenditures leaves out of account not only national defense, but leaves out of account the social choice we exercise with respect to the 2/3 of the national product that now goes into personal consumption expenditure. That's a social choice. And I happen to think that, to coin a phrase, taxes are the price of civilization. And I think the consequences for the kind of cuts in civilian expenditures and the kinds of redistribution of income that are coming about, I think these people are sowing the wind. Galbraith is right. Conservatives have to worry about social tranquility. There are value choices involved there that ought to be debated as such, and those choices should not be beclouded by a lot of technical talk about inflation and prosperity. Those are two quite separate issues. Thank you very much. Considering the fact that I have a good deal of power, although you can all vote with your feet, and that on this subject, if you haven't noticed, I tend to feel like the little boy at a spelling bee who was asked to spell Fred Kahn's favorite word, banana, and he stopped and scratched his head and then said, "I know how to spell it, I just don't know when to stop." I congratulate myself on this. The floor is open to questions and to discussion, ladies and gentlemen. Microphone is not on? Oh, do we have a microphone for the audience? On both sides, okay. I'm clearly unfamiliar with this process. There are microphones available for anyone who would like to make himself, herself heard. Yes, sir.
An oil and gas business is, in fact, number of derricks available, number of laborers to man them, or staff them rather. And a related question is, why don't we change policies so that instead of investing half again as much in takeovers as we do in capital investment, why don't we try and direct money precisely at capital investment instead of Mobil Oil Company buying up Montgomery wards and that kind of thing?
I think, by the way, that it's really in many ways the same question. Graham Allison was saying to me, one question at a time. It's one question. The question is, why don't we, let me sharpen it a little, why don't we raise revenues in 83, 84, and thereby get a tightening in fiscal policy, which most of us agree ought to happen? Why don't we do it by levying some kind of a windfall profit tax or tariff on oil and on natural gas? Bill Niskanen, do you want to cover that?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that we do have a tight fiscal policy. We are reducing the total federal claim on our national output, and that's what the essence of a tight fiscal policy is. My immediate response to the suggestion that we ought to tax all the profits away from the oil companies is that it's fundamentally unconstitutional. There's something in the Fifth Amendment that says the federal government cannot take property without due process, public purpose, and compensation. Now, we have forgotten the Fifth Amendment for some while, but we ought to recognize that taking the profits from a stream of resources is effectively a taking of property. Now, I see all the lawyers in the audience nodding, oh, but it's much more complex than that, and the courts have been, yeah, well, to hell with that.
Questions? Don't be intimidated.
I don't understand what the justification is for all the military spending.
Well, I'm not especially prepared to develop the case for that. I invite you to investigate the issue and to make the case to your congressman. I have been in the defense business for 13 years in the defense analysis business, and I understand that it enough to recognize that these issues are complex and are unlikely to be decided in this forum.
Well, these are complex. The other ones aren't complex, but these are.
No, I'm telling you that I'm just not prepared to make the case for the level and detail of the defense program that we have. You should recognize that the Carter administration in late 79 and 1980 came to much the same recognition as the Reagan administration, proposed a large defense build-up in fiscal 81 and a 5% real increase from 81 on. What Mr. Reagan has proposed is a 7% real increase from 81 on, 82 on actually. And the differences between the judgment about the Carter administration about what kind of defense buildup was necessary and that by the Reagan administration is not very large. Now, both of them may be wrong, but it's not something that I think that we can easily address and resolve tonight.
Yep, go ahead.
I have a question for Professor Niskanen. You mentioned that the deficit in the federal deficit has got nothing to do in the change in interest rates. I always believed the Chicago school, especially Milton Friedman, believes that the bigger the federal deficit, the higher the interest rate. I mean, how are you going to say that there will be no big, with the bigger the federal deficit, there will be no high interest rates?
Well, it is wholly plausible that the federal government crowds out private borrowing somewhere in the world. Federal deficits do. As it turns out, however, that you can't really find any relationship between the public sector borrowing in the United States, or the federal deficit specifically, and interest rates in the United States. And you don't find any relationship across countries between the public sector borrowing in that country and the private investment in that country. The primary reason for that is that we have an international or world capital market, and the relevant constraint on public sector borrowing is the world supply of savings and not just that specific to this country. Now, in some sense, we need kind of an arms control treaty on public sector borrowing. It's a situation where it would pay all of us if we could all reduce our public sector borrowing somewhat, but it doesn't really pay any one country to do so, including the United States, which bulks fairly large in this business. The public sector deficit, I've increasingly come to a position where we ought to think about the public sector deficit in much the same way that we think about business borrowing. If a business borrows money and invests it correctly, the business can increase its absolute debt over the course of its whole history and be perfectly healthy. And I see no reason why that cannot be the case in the public sector. That means that I think that it's probably appropriate to use deficits to finance increases in the capital stock, including increases in the capital stock of the defense program, if in fact that investment is fundamentally worthwhile. But I think that there's more consensus within the economics community about a tolerance for fairly large deficits than there is in the body politic, and that's going to represent a major problem in the next year or so. The numbers that look like they're coming out seem very large, but it's important to recognize that they bulk 2 or 3% of our GNP. Give you some rough parameters. It takes something like a $60 billion deficit to keep the real public sector debt, total debt, from going up. It takes something like a $90 billion deficit to keep the ratio of the debt to GNP from going down. So it's these are public communication problems in some sense more than economic problems.
Question back there. Ah, yes, Larry Summers.
I was struck by Alan Meltzer's description of current progress against inflation through monetary restraint. DRI forecasts that the GNP deflator says the GNP deflator rose 9.0% in 1980, and forecasts that the calendar increase for 1981 will also be 9.0%. This despite substantial unfavorable supply shocks in 1980 from oil prices and substantial favorable supply shocks from oil prices in 1981. Similar shocks in food, similar shocks in exchange rates. I wonder if, in light of the recent British experience, he could describe any examples of countries that have had long-sustained inflation of the kind we that have been successfully stopped by programs of gradual monetary restraint.
Yes. Japan reduced its rate of inflation from 24% to 4% over a period of 4 years by a policy of sustained gradual reduction in money growth. Switzerland reduced its rate of inflation from 12% to about -1% over a period of about 3 years by sustained gradual monetary reduction. Germany, you want me to continue?
Well, I'd like you to describe.
There are large numbers of others that I can add. In fact, let me turn the question back. I do not know a single country that's ever reduced its inflation without pursuing a policy of monetary restraint. So the only issue would be gradualism versus some kind of cold turkey, and that would be a case of whether we want to have about how big the social cost would be.
Alan, wouldn't you agree that a related question is at what cost in terms of unemployment and lost output?
Yes.
And that's the crucial question.
The argument about gradualism, which I understand Larry Summers to be raising, the argument about gradualism is based upon our belief, which we believe is reasonably well supported, but I mean that's still a basis of our judgment of the evidence that the reduction will be slower if the policy is credible than if it is incredible, and that the policy will be more credible if it is announced and followed. So that in place of your system of having the government set up price and wage guidelines for people and telling people how they should set their wages and prices, I would say that the much more effective kind of program for controlling prices and wages is for the government to say what it intends to do and then do it. The problem with most of these governments is, including our own, is that they announce all kinds of good programs, but they don't follow them.
My question, though, went to sustained inflation, which was stopped by a gradual program of monetary restraint. Yes. Your Japanese and German examples described sudden inflation that was stopped by a sudden program of monetary restraint. The Japanese
inflation actually was a mixture, as ours is, of one-time price level changes, so-called supply shocks, and sustained inflation over a period of years.
What was the Japanese rate of inflation?
Japanese
3
rate of
years
inflation
before the 24%.
Right. It ran something in the neighborhood of 8%, I believe, 6 to 8% over a period of the early 70s. It then shot up to 24% as a result of their efforts to support the dollar during the 1971-72 period, and also as a result of the supply shock. There was a mixture of two things there. The important thing is, of course, that ex post, looking back over that period, we can easily figure out what was a supply shock and what was not. What we don't know at the time was how much of each is involved in those data. And the problem for people to see is to see the prices coming down, to see the sustained reductions in money growth, and to form a belief that, in fact, the expectation is that inflation is going to come down. Let me take one example in the United States. We came down from a period of about 5 to 6% or 7% maintained inflation and a one-year inflation of 12%. We came down to something in the neighborhood of 4 to 5% just before the Carter administration took office. All right? The inflation rate in the United States was down to 4 to 5%. The Carter administration then came in. Arthur Burns helped them, produced a high rate of money growth, and sent the inflation rates back up again.
Professor Galbraith is even more restless than I am, Ken.
Well, I have 2 or 3 thoughts which I would like to leave just for the record. I must say I warm to the reluctance which Mr. Niskanen has in defending military expenditures, and I congratulate him on that. I would only warn him as a Democrat in a mild way that it is no proof that the Reagan administration is doing right because the Carter administration did something. And that theme has
we can agree on that.
That theme has run through a great deal of the discussion this evening. I must say it concerns me. As to you, Alan, you couldn't possibly be more completely wrong on the whole question of wage-price relationships. The Austrians, which had a remarkably successful combination of full employment and stable prices, have a deliberate, committed social market policy by which they calculate the possible wage increases every year that can be sustained within the price level. And you know that as well as I do. And the Germans do the same thing less deliberately, and the Swiss do it very specifically, occasionally reducing wages to maintain price stability, and they call it in Swiss fashion free enterprise, and that evidently has fooled the hell out of you.
No.
And the Japanese trade unions have the same basis, the same commitment to keeping their wage claims within the price structure, and they've made it official in the last few months. I have only one other thought. Other than that, there's something to be said for your position on the deficit. But aren't Mr. Niskanen, aren't you retreating from the balanced budget that your principal promised during the campaign with rather headlong speed?
Come on, that's unfair, Ken.
Well, and shouldn't I worry about that a bit?
Come on.
Doesn't that throw an enormous pressure over on Alan and the whole need for monetary restraint? Sorry, this was a minute that I saved myself from my regular speech.
Do I get equal time?
Well, the dean is instructing that we ought to be closing the proceedings. Is this a guillotine, Graham? All right, we all take 1 minute.
Well, I admire the way in which you like and laud the Swiss. Because if we could have 15 men, because that's exactly what there are in the Swiss Office of Price Control, and I have that on the authority of Karl Brunner, 15 men in the Swiss Price Control who sample, don't control, but sample the prices on the market. If we could end inflation as well as Switzerland has with 15 men, I would join your program. But let me cite you one experience on the other side, and that's the experience that I have from going to Brazil, where I helped them with their inflation. When I arrived, it was 40%. It's now 100% and going up to 130%. And during that period, every price was controlled, and by an authoritarian government which had absolute authority over every price. The fact is that all those price controls, all they could do was just change the prices, because with the basic monetary and fiscal policies that Brazil was running, there was simply no way in which they could either not run into enormous black markets or just allow the prices to move up as the market dictated. And they chose the latter, so that during a period in which inflation went from 40% to over 100%, prices were controlled every step of the way.
In conclusion, I am intrigued that the major policies that have been recommended to be added to that of the Reagan program are wage and price controls, a policy which in the last 30 years could have been sold only to President Nixon, and an incomes policy which couldn't even be sold to President Carter. My suggestion is that the economic alternative or alternatives that have been posed here tonight do not merit serious consideration.
There is a slight sort of, sort of guilt by association element to that argument, because Nixon did it badly doesn't mean that it can't be made to work right. I will say two very quick things. One is, I wish Larry Summers, who was over there and teaches economics at MIT and asked those questions before, hadn't raised the international comparison issue. Wage-setting procedures and institutions differ so sharply as among countries that to conclude that because of what happens in Brazil or in Chile or on the other side of the moon, that therefore something can be made to work in the United States is, I think, a massive non sequitur. On the business of wage policy, I'll cite you something that I once heard Helmut Schmidt, when he was finance minister, say to a small group of Americans. He said, you people don't understand about economic policy. Take wages. You really have to sort of leave that to collective bargaining. All this incomes policy business and all that, really, what do you mean? Of course, it is true that as finance minister, I spend 3/4 of my time every year between January and April making damn sure that free collective bargain comes out right. I think we're done for the evening. Thank you very much.